But Sheila Jackson would like to go a lot further than that. Lee has just introduced a bill called the Leading Against White Supremacy Act of 2023. Now, it's not an exaggeration to say this single bill would do more to criminalize speech, previously constitutionally guaranteed speech, than any other piece of legislation that has been proposed in the entire history of this country. That's not an overstatement at all, and to prove it, we're going to read directly from the bill. Here it is, quote, "A conspiracy to engage in white supremacy-inspired hate crime shall be determined to exist between two or more persons, at least one of whom published material advancing white supremacy, white supremacist ideology, antagonism based on, quote, replacement theory, or hate speech that vilifies or is otherwise directed against any non-white person or group," end quote. Now, nowhere in the legislation is the term white supremacy or white supremacist ideology ever defined. Of course it's never defined. It's left open. It's subjective. Anything can be white supremacy. But the bill does specifically point to something called replacement theory, white supremacist ideology. If you engage in either one of them, you go to federal prison, possibly for a very long time. So all that's required under this piece of legislation, which has not been laughed out of Congress yet, all that's required is that your political opinions, quote, could, as determined by a reasonable person, motivate actions by a person predisposed to engaging in a white supremacy-inspired hate crime. So what would qualify as a felony under this law? Well, virtually everything, but among them would be pointing out that Democratic Party politicians, including Chuck Schumer, the leading Senate Democrat, have long bragged that they are flooding this country with immigrants in order to change the demography to maintain political power for themselves. They've said that many times, they've written it, they've bragged about it on camera, but if you notice it under this bill, you would be criminally responsible for the violent acts of people you have never met, and you would go to jail for terrorism. Now, what's most interesting about this bill is that it's race specific. Nothing in Sheila Jackson Lee's legislation would apply to, say, black supremacy or murder sprees by people who aren't white supremacists. The massacre in Waukesha, for example. So that means that Democratic Party politicians can continue to say whatever they want with impunity. The First Amendment still applies to them, but not to anyone who doesn't vote for them. So that's the definition of tyranny. It's horrifying. It's a direct attack on the Bill of Rights, on our core freedoms guaranteed by the U.S. government for 250 years. We shouldn't be surprised by this, however, because it's consistent with what Biden has promised since the day he got into office. And the promise was that race-blind justice, which is the entire foundation of the rule of law in the West, has been for centuries, is done. The new model, South Africa. That's the new model, South Africa, a country we never talk about because no one wants to admit what's happened there over the past 29 years. But on the basis of that, Biden tried to allocate farm aid on the basis of skin color. A federal judge blocked that plan, but it has not stopped the Democratic Party because no one's repudiated the idea. No one on the right has been brave enough to say, no, the federal government can never award or punish on the basis of skin color. That is immoral and is contrary to American law. And because no one has said that, Democrats, including Sheila Jackson Lee, have decided that their opponents are terrorists. And they're terrorists because of their race. And once you're a terrorist, what do we get to do? We get to take all your stuff. We get to seize your assets. It shouldn't surprise you. That is actually unfolding in the state of California. Always the leading edge of lunacy. Watch this.
These economists have worked alongside us over this past year to come up with potential estimates for what reparations in the form of compensation or cash payments can look like for African Americans. That $500 billion number represents the state of California's maximum culpability for racist redlining practices. And that number represents the state of California's maximum liability. It is not a final recommendation coming out of the task force. Final recommendations do not come out until July 1 of 2023.
No, everything about this, of course, is bad and wrong, not just in practice, but in principle. But in practice, it sets up an incentive that the whole country is going to have to grapple with fairly soon. We've already been told that you can change your sex, your immutable characteristic, just by wishing it so. Men can become women, women can become men. Why then can't people change their race? That's a sincere question that is waved away as ridiculous, but it's not any more ridiculous than changing your sex. In fact, it's the same. So under laws like this, there is a huge incentive to change your race because you get paid for doing that. What are we going to do about that?